Hello, everyone, and welcome to Earth Chapters, brought to you by Pollinator Friendly Alliance. You can find us at pollinatorfriendly.org. Pollinator Friendly Alliance is a grassroots nonprofit powered by the enthusiasm of our partners and volunteers to protect the natural world, pollinators and their habitats. Remember, everything in the natural world is connected. An ecosystem is a community of living things that work together and rely upon the other. Let's be good stewards of the ecosystem. Today, in Chapter 2 of Earth Chapters, Attract Hummingbirds to Your Backyard with Carol Henderson and Fruiting Shrubs for Wildlife with Pete Widin. So let's get started.
My job today is to give all of you a really good case of spring fever so we can start getting out in the yard. I've been working with Ethel the last couple of days. We made a couple of new planters for flowers out on the deck, and we're going to be ready to welcome some hummingbirds here in the near future. Let's see, now I just have to. So I got started with this whole process of learning about landscaping for wildlife when I was hired to be the non-game wildlife program supervisor for the Department of Natural Resources way back in 1977. And one of my projects during the first 10 years of my job was to work on a book for landscaping for wildlife. And here's a cooperative bluebird in my backyard posing with my book. And two of the chapters in the book were special to people like yourselves. There's a chapter on butterfly, bee, and moth plants, and another chapter on hummingbird plants. So ever since then, I've been learning and trying out different plants in our own backyard with my wife. She's the one with the green thumb, and I just keep planting and keeping track of what's happening. This is what our backyard in Blaine looked like when we had first moved in 1978. Not much there except a doghouse and a tiny little spruce tree. And that's the same view a few years later after we had been adding plants that were plants I was interested in from my work with the Landscaping for Wildlife book. There's the back side of the yard where we've got a hedge in the back and then both annuals and perennials edging the yard. And then we had a walkout yard, so we flattened the top outside of the garage and put in a covered deck. And again, then we terraced the side. The inside of the deck provided a nice little eating area and places for lots of container plants and hanging plants. And then we put in the terraces on the side so we could put in additional flowers on the hillside for variety of hummingbirds, butterflies, and other pollinators, and just a lot of nice color. And then a few years after that, we added an upper deck so we could walk out from the kitchen onto the upper level and added more container plants and more planters on the top of the deck railing. So that's what the upper deck looked like. So we have a lot of areas for both container plants as well as garden plants. And last year I had quadruple bypass heart surgeries. And so when I was recovering, I spent a lot of time out on the deck enjoying the flowers and also the butterflies, bees, and hummingbirds coming to those flowers. So I got a chance to see this up close and personal for many, many enjoyable hours and then taking pictures. So this is one of the plants I had there, a salvia. And you can see on the top, this is the anther of the salvia, which is a Latin American flower that's particularly pollinated by hummingbirds. And here's a hummingbird in my backyard coming in to visit one of the salvias. And you can see that those anthers are depositing lots of pollen right on the head of the hummingbird. So this is really fascinating to see up close. And now you can see all the pollen on the top of the hummingbird's head. Now this doesn't function really in Minnesota since we're not trying to pollinate the plants, but this is how it occurs in nature. And we also had lots of other species like bumblebees coming into those because those are really good nectar sources. Now hummingbirds are voracious little feeders. They're tiny, but they're always hungry. Now the human energy equivalent for all the nectar they eat would be that one person eating 3,500 pancakes per day or 5 pounds of sugar every 40 minutes. That's kind of awesome to think about. they consume anywhere from 1.5 to 8 times their weight in nectar every day. And they process all of this nectar about every 15 minutes, using up over 96% of all the energy, and then leaving the rest behind. So it passes through their bodies very quickly. Now the hummingbirds are returning over this next month from wintering grounds ranging from Costa Rica all the way up through Guatemala, southern Mexico. And they normally come in here to the Twin Cities area about the 5th to the 10th of May. So we have about a month to get ready for their arrival. Now, if it weren't for the yellow-bellied sapsucker, the northernmost range of hummingbirds would be—
Rose, come here.
we would be somewhere down in central Missouri. But the sapsuckers open up sap wounds on trees, and the nectar is used by hummingbirds when they first arrived as a source of energy from the tree sap rather than flower nectar. And they also are attracted to the insects that are also attracted to tree sap. So in early May, mid-May, there are not that many flowers blooming. So people can put out an old traditional hummingbird feeder if they wish. 1 part cane sugar to 4 parts water, boil it, chill it, serve it, keep the rest in the refrigerator to refill as needed. You don't need any coloring. They'll be attracted by the red plastic. And you can clean the feeders every week to 10 days. And then as an additional enticement, hummingbirds need protein. So you can take some overripe cantaloupe and bananas, put them in a string bag, and it will attract fruit flies. So when the hummingbirds come to the feeder, then they go over to the fruit fly feeder and capture those little fruit flies. But you're going to need to put a bucket underneath that fruit because it's going to drip and make a mess otherwise. Also, hummingbirds need water, bird baths, but not traditional bird baths. They like to bathe in mist, and if you can come up with a source of misting for the birds at your bird bath, that's what they really like best of all. These are pictures of a hummingbird that was visiting our backyard when Ethel was watering the flowers last summer, and it just sat there underneath the stream of spray that she was spraying from the garden hose, and the bird stayed there for about 10 minutes taking a little misting bath from the garden hose. So anyway, if you can find a way to provide a fine mister for your bird bath, that will bring in hummingbirds as well. But what I really wanted to share with you today is the flowers that are most attractive. Native wildflowers, I've got 5 for you. And this is something where if you've got a cell phone handy, you might want to take a screenshot of this to save having to scribble lots of notes. Cardinal flower, columbine, fireweed, spotted touch-me-not, and pale touch-me-not. So that's, again, cardinal flower, columbine, fireweed, spotted touch-me-not, pale touch-me-not. First of these is cardinal flower, native plant, northern Minnesota, but native to the state. And the program is not advancing here. I'm not sure what's happening.
Try your up and down arrow, Carol.
Yep, that's what I'm doing. There we go. Columbine, another one, early spring. It's a good one for those first birds coming back. Fireweed, a common northern Minnesota species. The hummingbirds like this one. And then along the edges of lakes and marshy areas, you can get spotted touch-me-not and pale touch-me-not. There's the pale touch-me-not. It's more yellowish. Now, these are non-native, non-invasive flowers coming up. And this is my short list of my favorite flowers. First of all, fuchsias. They work very well early in May before anything else is out. And the salvias. Those are really the sweet plants for the hummingbirds. Black and blue and black and bloom are my favorite of all. They grow up to 3 to 4 feet tall, great for hummingbirds. Scarlet sage, rockin, deep purple, hot lips, Ladian red or Texas sage, and then also mirage or cherry red. These are the 7 kinds of salvias that are a sure thing to bring birds through the whole summer and right up until frost in the fall. Black and blue and black and bloom work right up until frost time. Yeah, we're still jamming here. We got fuchsia. Here's the black and blue on the right, and black and bloom. These are going to be bringing the birds all summer long. Scarlet sage or salvia. This is a really good one. Nice container plant. This is another salvia similar to black and bloom, but it's red. It's called Rockin'. Deep purple, another similar salvia. Here's one called Hot Lips. Here's a hummingbird coming into a hot lips flower. Texas sage or Lady in Red. Here's one called Mirage, very nice red one for the birds. These are all the pictures I was taking while I was enjoying my deck last summer. Now these are other hummingbird flowers that are very good, and there's a wide variety. So these are ones that you could add to your container plants or put in your garden as you wish. As far as I know, these are not necessarily invasive. Monarda, nicotiana or flowering tobacco, coral bells, foxglove, pentas, red petunias, vinca or rosy periwinkle, the red varieties, and then canna. Here's the Monarda, Cambridge Scarlet and Garden View. You need to ask or check out to make sure which ones might have problems with mildew. Some Monardas are more vulnerable to that than others. So just check that out when you're seeing what Monardas you might like. Flowering tobacco comes in different colors, but red obviously is preferred by hummingbirds. Coral bells, they work well. Foxglove, another one. Little bird has to stick its head right up inside the flower to get the nectar. Pentas, a real nice container plant in red varieties that will bring in the hummers. Red petunias. And the last one I'll mention is the canna. Now that's one where you have to dig up the roots each fall and bring them in, or they're going to die from the cold. So it takes a little more work. And then finally, vinca. The last 3 that I'll mention are scarlet runner beans. These are really fun to plant. I kid people, they should plant them and then jump out of the way because they may grow up to 10 or 15 feet up of a fence or a trellis. And then you can save the beans in the fall when they're ripe, so you can replant them next spring. And they're also good in soups and stews. Cardinal climber, and then another nice vine, and finally drop more honeysuckle. Here's the scarlet runner bean, a real nice plant for trellises. Cardinal climber, we have this one on our deck, very nice little red flower for the hummers. And then drop more honeysuckle. This one also works well on trellises, and it blooms right up until fall frost. And it's not the same as trumpet creeper, which is a more invasive vine, which can invite itself to places where you don't want it. So drop more honeysuckle is better. So those are my short list plants, the one that you might like to consider for planting this year. I know that the garden centers, some are open and some can take phone orders now, but we're going to have a lot of fun in the next month or so getting ready for the hummingbirds, and hopefully you'll have them visiting your flowers throughout the summer, and that will add to your enjoyment with the other pollinators that will be visiting in your garden. I threw a little ringer in here. This is a green-throated mango from Costa Rica. I thought you might enjoy a little variety. Hummers are a fascinating family of birds. There are over 340 different species in the Americas, but our favorite is, of course, the ruby-throated hummingbird. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carol. That was so great. We couldn't see your picture of your face for a while there, but I'm going to ask you to start your video now. Anyway, do you see the
Okay,
to start your video? There we go.
here I am.
Thank you, Carol. Wow, that was, I'm going to run out and get some salvia right now.
Yeah, if it's called a salvia, the birds are going to be waiting for you.
So we have Pete Widin here ready to step in, and so we're gonna switch our screen here. This will stop by June. Okay, continue.
Thanks, Carol. That was great.
Thank you.
I've got a patio that's got a lot of empty space, so I'm excited to fill that up with some hummingbird plants for sure. And some medicinal herbs. I've been perusing the Richter's herb catalog lately. There's some amazing stuff in there. So here I'll share my screen. All right, everybody let me know if you can see, maybe Lori verbally.
Looks great. Just
okay, let's go to full screen.
Go to full screen, yeah.
Okay, if you guys see me looking down, I'm just looking at my notes. So I'm Pete Widin, super excited to be here with you today. I'll introduce myself a little bit in the next slide. I'll be talking about, of course, native fruiting shrubs for wildlife, and not just attracting birds, but by virtue of planting wonderful, hardy, drought-tolerant, or site-specific, site-selected native shrubs. We are in effect also planting for beneficial insects, which a lot of birds are attracted to as well. So we can get multiple benefits out of what we're up to. So this is me at a tree planting with Great River Greening. I'm excited for when we can get out and do volunteer work like that again, but I live on a blueberry farm here in Stillwater, Minnesota. There's plenty to do. So aside from my work on the farm here, I design edible and native landscapes at the residential scale for people who want to DIY their landscape, but also the farm scale to restore native ecosystems, create foraging opportunities, and plan perennial crop systems such as elderberry. So like I said initially, our choices benefit many and more organisms than we might even ever be aware of, from creating healthy soils to healthy plants. We are creating some of those and putting in place some of those foundational building blocks of a productive ecosystem, even on a small scale in our backyard. So from clockwise top left, the eastern bluebird, which are just coming back to the farm here in Stillwater. And we've got the beautiful 4-inch wingspan Cecropia moth, which it lays its eggs on and feeds on many different shrub species in our region, including non-natives such as Spirea. And we've got the wood thrush and syrphid flies, an interesting, I believe, parasitic fly. And then also a bunch of bees, including the mining bee, which this is one of them. It's the Andrenidae group of bees and family of bees. And I just wanted to point them out because as I was looking through Heather Holmes' Identifying Native Pollinators, Native Bees book and how they're associated with various shrubs, pretty much any shrub you're going to put in your landscape is going to attract those. So it's pretty exciting. So we're really looking at, when we're starting to just take this higher level view of what we might include in our landscape, stacking the benefits, really starting to look at, from an aesthetic standpoint, but also from a forage time, a forage availability standpoint, what the time of year, the month is, and the quality of the blooms that we're putting out there. So clockwise from top left, we have our smooth rose, Rosa blanda. This on the top right, I believe, is actually a European highbush cranberry, but we also have our native, which is Viburnum trilobum highbush cranberry. New Jersey tea, which I won't mention too much in depth, but it's one of my favorite shrubs. It just doesn't happen to have as prominent of a fruit, although migrating birds do enjoy it. And then I'm keeping this one on the bottom left, which is a nectar source, a mystery shrub, because I think it might be my all-time favorite. So I'll leave a little mystery for later on. So it's really about quality and type of forage. And we can see, of course, in the shape of a flower, such as that smooth wild rose, that's going to be more of a source of pollen And then with some of these more tubular flowers, they have nectar resources, often nectar reservoirs that say a hummingbird or some type of lepidopteran, as like a butterfly or moth, may be visiting. And so it's not just about, you know, is it pollen or nectar? It's also about when is that blooming, such as this mystery plant on the bottom left is blooming in April when not that much stuff is out. And that was so cool to learn from Carol's talk about the sapsucker hummer connection. I didn't know that. And then, you know, all these different plants, their flowers are out for different amounts of time. They have different lengths of time that they bloom for. So whenever I'm working on a design for a landscape, I put together a spreadsheet where I've just got all the species on the left, and I've got months from April to October in the rows, or sorry, in the columns, and I can see where things overlap. So I always try to have, say, 3 different species blooming at any one time, and mix up those. If you're mixing up colors and species, you're often going to, by default, mix up and end up creating variety and diversity in the morphology, the shape of the flower, the type of forage that it's providing. So 3 at any one time is just kind of my base rule for creating some food options. And aside from food, this is important about cover quality. And in a lot of our yards, a lot of the birds who are attracted to, say, the suburban landscape in general are edge-loving species. They like these more open areas, but with clusters of, say, shrubs and tree lines. And so on the top left here, the red twig dogwood, which is actually next to a stream here, is providing such a great cover for birds to be able to, say, hide out from the hawk who may be nearby, or such as this oriole, which is actually in a tamarack tree, not a shrub. Being able to light on a certain shrub in the landscape where they can get a good view but feel protected at the same time, be able to perch and have that expansive view and understand their landscape and where the food opportunities are for their little chicks, having nests, and really looking at the density of the shrubbery. Different species are going to like a different density. Some birds like more thickety areas. Some birds really like the horizontal layering of, say, a pagoda dogwood, and we'll talk more about that. So where it's located in the yard is really important as well. Not simply is it dense or is it layered. And those edge conditions, creating a nice transition between the forest line or a tree line and the greater yard, and giving birds some areas to stop and hide out if they need to get away from a predator, can be very helpful. So not only the structure, but the leaves of these shrubs are very important both as forage and as shelter. So you see that robin, baby robin, who is just hatched there, hiding out in its little shrubby spot. And on the top left, we've got our eastern tiger swallowtail larvae, who are feeding on various shrubs. I don't have it written down. Maybe Lori would know what their preferred host plants are, but I know they do enjoy a number of our natives, especially the black cherry, and they may enjoy the chokecherry, which I'll talk about later on. And then we've got our leafcutter bees, who are amazing pollinators of pretty much all tree, fruit, and berry crops that we have in our region here. People actually specifically create habitat for and buy leafcutter bees to pollinate strawberries and other berry crops. So here at the blueberry farm, we're looking at different types of mining bees and others who specialize in blueberries. Here, this leafcutter bee is actually chewing on aromatic fragrant sumac, which is another one of our natives. So forage, in terms of once those flowers are pollinated, we get fruit, right? And we've got our native black elderberry, Sambucus canadensis, and our native winterberry, Ilex verticillata. We do have another native holly as well, but this one there are a lot of different varieties that have been selected of winterberry. I tend to personally lean toward using the straight native species that are selected from local seed sources. I just tend to think those are better adapted to our area. Perhaps there's a connection between our local fauna, birds, etc., and perhaps being evolve toward some trait that that plant may have that could be lost by selecting for color or size of berry, something like that. But it's really about, you know, when do these fruit sources ripen, and also how long do they persist? How long do they stay on the plant? So this black elderberry, for example, those are going to ripen over the course of a couple, maybe 3 weeks in about August, but they're all going to fall off pretty soon if they're not, you know, otherwise eaten by us. By the way, our native black elderberry is different from the European in that we don't actually have to cook this to eat it. It doesn't have the cyanide compounds that are toxic that the European does. So if you do plant this, you can make good use of it for your own cooking or even fresh juices. But those berries are going to fall off right away once they ripen. However, something like the winterberry, which isn't as palatable as the elderberry for a lot of birds, but those berries are going to stay on until they're eaten. And at my parents' place, those berries they'll ripen in toward the fall, but they'll stay on there through the winter, and without rotting too much, they stay on in good condition. And so when the waxwings or robins or even cardinals come through, they can find an emergency source of food, especially when migrating flocks are coming. So now we're getting into how to select the best fits for your personal property. I'm just simplifying this to a large degree, but it really isn't rocket science, especially when we're working with natives, because we can look at the types of habitats we might see a plant in, such as, oh, I see this black elderberry growing, you know, in a decently wet area, not waterlogged, but close to a pond. Maybe that'll work by my, you know, drainage ditch or something like that. We can look and extrapolate from where we see these plants out at our local parks and things. And especially when they're blooming or fruiting, they're of course much easier to recognize. So matching the plant with place, it starts with, for me, the soil type and how that affects the soil moisture. So we have sand, which if you have a lot of sand, of course, it's better drained. It's all about the amount of pore space in your soil. Silt, which is a mineral, a finer mineral that's deposited by rivers and old floodplains, or even blown deposits from the wind. Clay, if you've got clay, you probably know it. Maybe your soil cracks a lot when it's dry. Perhaps your soil doesn't drain very well, which could potentially mean you've got clay. And that's a really sticky soil. It usually means you've got a decent amount of clay there, which tends to hold water for a longer time. And loam, which is a more organic matter. And the more organic matter we have in our soil, generally, the more kind of mid-range it's going to be between how much water it holds and how well it drains, how much air those plants can get. So if you've got more sand, if it's better drained, just keep that in mind. If you've got more clay, of course, you're working likely with plants who may prefer a little wetter soils overall. So the next thing we're looking at is light conditions. And there's three main categories I put this into: full sun, part sun, and more toward the shade. So full sun would be 8 hours or more of sunlight per day. Part shade would be 4 to 6. Part sun would be part sun or part shade, 4 to 6 hours of sunlight. And then beyond that, we get into dappled shade and deeper shade. And I really emphasize looking at the types of ecosystems, or if you go to the landscape arboretum where they have those plants, but if you find something growing on the edge of a forest and it's really healthy, maybe it's similar soil to what you've got, it's going to work well in your area, most likely. So also looking at meeting your personal needs. So there may be a few things you're thinking about. When we look at cold hardiness and natives, we're usually pretty safe to assume that something's native to Minnesota, it's going to be hardy in our area. But if we want something that's going to grow quickly, such as to replace this buckthorn on the left here, which birds love those berries, that's one reason why it spreads so easily, we can plant things like elderberry and hazelnut, which I'll get into, that grow quickly and can occupy some of those similar niches to take the place of buckthorn once we get rid of it, or at least assist with that. And if you want something fast growing, creating quick privacy hedges and establishing quick cover for birds, we can look at how quickly these plants are growing, and I'll mention that a little bit as I move forward. And this is our red twig dogwood on the right here. Beautiful winter color. So getting into the actual plants, which you probably came here for. So buckthorn, like I said, or elderberry, like I said, is great for replacing buckthorn. No need to replace buckthorn with buckthorn. It'll do that for you. This plant is really easy to propagate from hardwood cuttings that you take when the plants are dormant in the winter. So you just need 2 sets of buds, 2 nodes from an elderberry stem. And you can put it in the ground if it's, between a 1/4 inch and a 1/2 inch in diameter stem, and it'll likely sprout and grow for you. And actually, I wanted to mention, I'm helping out the Main Street Project, who does regenerative farming with chickens and hazelnuts and elderberries down near Northfield. I'm going to be selling elderberry cuttings, 5 cuttings for $15 to help them out over the next couple months. So reach out to me at the email at the end if you're interested in getting some of those. There's some great varieties that they're putting together for you guys that are tried and true. They're great berries. And so not only does this shrub attract these great birds in addition to the other 120 species, I wanted to mention that Wild Ones, which is a native habitat, native landscape enthusiast group, a wonderful educational organization nationally, but who has local chapters like St. Croix Oak Savannah and some other great chapters in the Twin Cities area, put together a wonderful book that I did use for the birds who are attracted to these shrubs. So you can get that for free on the wildones.org website. I think you have to get it in person once we start meeting up again. But black elderberry, it's really versatile, it's very fast growing, and it is extremely palatable for birds and humans. It's actually pollinated by wind, but it does attract a lot of bees as well. And so here, this is my parents' place. This is the best picture I could find online or anywhere of a pagoda dogwood. And it's the plant kind of on the left off of center, this big one, and it's actually planted in full sun. Most people only think they grow in shade, but we were surprised when we took down a big tree. So this is a wonderful, very architectural plant. You can see that top layer is just one part of the quote unquote pagoda, and these berries attract all kinds of great birds, the grosbeak, thrasher, etc., including waxwings. I just love the waxwings. Their feathers are so beautiful. And so it's going to attract a lot of the short-tongued bees, which is a whole family of bees. The thing is with a lot of these pollinators, a lot of these plants just haven't been closely studied enough to really understand exactly who is, at least that information is not very easily available, exactly who is visiting. Even some of these more in-depth books I've been looking at, it just says these general groups of bees that are attracted. So just know that as you're planting these plants, there is a whole host of various beneficial insects who not only do bees pollinate, but wasps and flies, who may also parasitize other larvae or aphids that may be existing in your vegetable garden or your garden in general. So it's more than just pollinators. We're attracting beneficial insects with these beautiful natives. Moving through to chokecherry, and I always forget, I think the chokecherry blossoms may actually be the one that I don't personally enjoy the fragrance of, although they're just a bee magnet. So this is the andrenid bees, the mining bees that I mentioned at the beginning. I said, what doesn't attract them? Because everything seems to draw them in. The chokecherry is a prized fruit among many birds, including the bluebird and the vireo, which isn't quite as common in some of the Twin Cities area I've seen, but it can draw some more unusual birds in and create some more of that forest edge situation that so many birds really enjoy when they're able to flit between different habitats. And that forest edge is often where plant diversity and biodiversity are highest. There's the transition between habitats. This is one of my favorites, and I wanted to include the fall color of the American hazelnut. The nuts themselves do attract larger species such as woodpecker and turkey, but there are a lot of smaller songbirds who eat the catkins, which are the male flowers on the right there, which are full of pollen and rich in protein. So they'll eat those earlier in the year, in the spring when they come out. And the great thing about hazelnut is that it can handle some really, really poor soils. In fact, if you get up into northern Wisconsin, on pure sand, you'll see them growing. So if you happen to have a very poor soil, or perhaps a site where you've got a slope you want to stabilize, Hazelnut creates a nice thicket as well, which can provide some extra cover for birds and for nesting. And I also saw that the hazelnut can be a larval host to the Luna moth, which isn't too surprising because the Luna moth, although it's not as common down here in the Twin Cities, it's more up once you get up north. That moth prefers birch trees, and the hazelnut's in the birch family. Nannyberry, this is another fall color beauty. The nannyberry prefers wetter soils, although it is fairly versatile. This might be a shrub you haven't heard of before, but you've probably heard of the genus Viburnum, which is well represented in a lot of our landscape nurseries. So a lot of these are larger shrubs. There are a couple smaller ones I'll get into. The thing is that it also, makes a difference on, you can train these to be a little bit smaller if you wanted to, or the nannyberry, if you got slightly wetter soils, maybe even part shade, you could make a decent hedge out of that for privacy as well. And I love this plant, not only because the flowers are very fragrant and I love the scent, but also because I find the berries very tasty. They're a little bit mealy, they're not juicy, but it's kind of like a raisin with a flat seed in it that won't hurt your teeth. I really enjoy them. It's also hosts many different caterpillar species. A lot of those are moths, and so moths do pollinate as well, of course, although to varying degrees, depending on how long a moth or a butterfly actually lives. Some of the adults don't feed. The buttonbush is a cool one, which is native to east central Minnesota, southeast Minnesota. It's much more common in Michigan, lower Michigan, where I studied landscape architecture, in swamp areas. So it really likes a good amount of sun. The blossoms are surprisingly fragrant. They're obviously beautiful as well. And this is where we get into a slightly different timing of flowering and fruiting a little bit later than some other plants. And we get into that different shape, which not only helps the aesthetics of the garden, but it's naturally going to attract different pollinators and beneficial insects with different shaped mouth parts, different adaptations to these plants. And it's a really important fall migration food, these fruits on the right. A lot of birds enjoy the seeds when they're flying through, and the swallowtail butterfly is never, never a bad thing to have around. Beautiful. Winterberry is another one that does like wet areas if you happen to have a steepy area that you don't want to mow or something like that. And you do need a male winterberry to help pollinate the females, or else they won't have all these beautiful berries. But you can see, even without the leaves, they're just even more striking. And these berries will persist without rotting and becoming gross throughout the winter. So it's also fairly versatile, and it's a little smaller of a shrub, although my parents do have some that as they age, they do get quite a bit taller. And we found that it attracts all types of different songbirds, including some of the flycatchers, which is interesting. So this is the mystery plant here, the eastern leatherwood. There's also a midwestern leatherwood that doesn't make its way up here, but this is a absolutely gorgeous plant that this picture on the left doesn't quite do the actual framework and architecture of the shrub itself justice. It's hard to find some good images of some of these shrubs, but it's absolutely a beautifully arranged plant in terms of its growth form. And then in April, we get these really cool little flowers. And I just saw it at my parents' place. My mom, Kathy, is a forester and native plant enthusiast. So I was very lucky to grow up around a lot of these different plants and creatures. It does like richer, moist soils, but my parents have it on the north side of their house in some richer soil. It's kind of clayey, and it is loving it there. A lot of songbirds are actually attracted to the fruit, which is really early in its ripening in May. And so we can start to see how we're able to spread some of this forage across the season and attract a lot of different interesting bees of various kinds, including some ground nesters, I believe. So basically, and this is serviceberry amelanchier, you're probably familiar with it. If you're not, it's a wonderful set of species, often 10 to 15 feet tall, but there are some smaller shrub varieties as well. Delicious for us. It's kind of like I don't know. It's a little bit like a blueberry grape flavor to me, and the birds will often get them before you do because they're so delicious to everybody. But the thing is that if you can understand your soils, if you've got good drainage or not, what type of light conditions you've got, and where you really want to have these plants long term, you can you can get pretty far in terms of finding something that's native, and especially at our local nurseries. I personally enjoy on the east side of the Twin Cities, Outback Nursery, and also Minnesota Native Landscapes. They have some great quality plants, and they avoid using systemic insecticides as far as I know, although it's always important to ask about neonicotinoid use or any systemic pesticides in general that are used on these plants, because chemicals in general, in my opinion, that are not organic in nature, that aren't modified from organic form as they exist in nature, don't have a place in our landscapes or our food or the food for our wildlife.
Thank you for joining us for today's Earth Chapter. Thanks to Pollinator Friendly Alliance, our host, and Ramsey County Soil and Water, our co-host. If you have questions or inquiries, please contact pollinatorfriendly.org.